Don't forget, you're going to die.
Welcome to the WeCroak podcast. I am your host, Hans Bergwall. And before I get into the episode, we've got some WeCroak updates for you. First of all, podcast episodes are now also on YouTube. So check that out. Find our channel on YouTube and give us a follow there. We'd really appreciate that. And if you'd rather watch this interview as opposed to just listen to it, that would be the place to do it. Other WeCroak updates, of course, the best way to support this podcast is to download the WeCroak app on your smartphone and then sign up for Leap. We've got a number of great things in there, including more quotes and a daily review tool and weekly challenges that bring up impermanence. And we think you'll really enjoy it. So check that out. Of course, we also have a Patreon for the podcast and stuff like that. And also, I, your host, Hansa Bergwall, am opening up my coaching business more publicly. So you will, by the time this episode is up, be able to see a link on the WeCroak website to my coaching practice. So if you are interested in living your life to the fullest and achieving your goals, let me know. Reach out to me there. All right, now about the episode. We have a fantastic episode for you with Colin Dickey, who is an author and a journalist, and he's written a number of books about America's fascination with the paranormal, with ghosts, with the occult. And he approaches it from a really journalistic sort of angle. He's interested in the stories and what makes people so passionate and obsessed and can't look away from this stuff. So I think what follows is kind of a philosophical discussion that's very October, very happy Halloween. And it's really about what does it say about us that we love a ghost story. So without further ado, I'll welcome Colin Dickey here. Welcome, Colin Dickey. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So we're here today to talk about ghosts of all things. Usually on the WeCroak podcast, we talk about death more, but you've written some books about visiting America's most haunted places. At least they have that reputation. Can you just start with a little bit about how you became interested in the topic?
Yeah, I mean, I got interested in the topic because I grew up in San Jose, California, which is the home of the Winchester Mystery House, which maybe some people will have heard of. It's sort of this bizarre Victorian mansion with 161 rooms built by this woman, Sarah Winchester, who was the daughter-in-law of the president of the Winchester Rifle Company. And I used to take tours there when I was a kid, and you'd hear these stories about how, you know, her husband and infant daughter died mysteriously, and she was came to believe that she was being pursued by ghosts, and a psychic told her that she was being pursued by the ghosts of anyone who had ever been killed by a Winchester rifle, and that the only way to keep them at bay would be to build a house that was never finished. Which I just thought was a cool story. And oh yeah, and she had to work on it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which she did for 31 years until the day she died. And so, like, I grew up with that as like a cool story. And at some point I thought, well, this would be a really interesting biography. This is a story about our kind of weird relationship to manifest destiny and the, you know, quote unquote winning of the West with this rifle. B, it's a story about this kind of pathological mourning, this woman who couldn't, you know, get over the deaths of her husband and daughter, and sort of turned her mourning into a kind of architectural statement. And that was really cool. And so I thought it'd be a pretty easy biography to write. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized and learned that much of the story that I had been told, that I just told you, is false, is made up. And so it shot my, my dreams of writing a biography about her, because the actual story I found was interesting, but not nearly as kind of sexy in that way. And not the kind of thing I felt like I could write a whole biography about. So I kind of shelved it for a little while, and, but it kept kind of gnawing at me. And at some point I realized I was really fascinated in the fiction as well as the history. And in other words, I was really interested in why these stories accrued around this house and why this house had become such a legend, influencing everybody from like Walt Disney's Haunted Mansion to Stephen King's novels. Like, it was such an important American artifact. And I was just fascinated by the stories that got told. And I decided that, there were others like that ghost stories are less to me about the paranormal than they are a means of us talking about history, about trauma, about mourning, and more prosaically about architecture and spaces and how we live and how we work and that kind of stuff. So that's how the book came together, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talked about the big Victorian mansion with all these rooms. I'm like, ugh, why is it always rich people that become ghosts?
Right, exactly. And yeah, I mean, one of the core questions that I asked when I was like going through this book is like basic things like that. Like, why, when you think of a haunted mansion, is it always a Victorian? It's never like you never go to a haunted mid-century modern house. You never go to like it always looks the same way. And that became a really interesting question to sort of go through and sort of think through, like, what does it mean to look haunted, and why are these buildings haunted in this way, shape, and form, and other ones are not? So yeah.
All right, why? Why? I'm dying to know now. Not
I
something I've
mean,
never thought of.
so some of it, I think a lot of it has to do, like, part of the reason why, say, a Victorian is more likely to like seem haunted is because they're built with just a lot more like nooks and crannies. Like, that's the architectural style. Like, like they're not big minimalist structures that are open. So there's lots of there's weird shadows. There's weird kind of creaks in the wood. The wood is older. It has, I mean, at some point every house has a history. Like you go into a house, you say like somebody died here, and that's going to be true of, I don't know, like a great majority of houses over a certain age. And so there's always this history to draw from, and there's something I think very specific about anachronistic architecture. Like, if something falls out of fashion and still kind of lingers, it suddenly starts to look different to us. So, like, when you think of like a haunted insane asylum, to pick another example, you're thinking, I'm guessing, of a place with like a big sort of clock tower in the front, and kind of big imposing structure with like kind of wings going off to each side, and that's like kind of like archetypal haunted insane asylum. And that's because that was a very specific architectural style. The Kirkbride asylums that were built in the second half of the 19th century, which then got replaced because psychiatric care and best practices evolved, and so we shifted to other kinds of hospitals. But these things are so huge that they were just difficult to tear down, and so they were just sort of left lingering on the landscape, often abandoned, and they started to take on this like doomy, eerie cast. So stuff like that.
Yeah, it strikes me that Victorian architecture, I mean, what defines it, besides it being older, is that they used a lot more ornamentation in those days, and buildings tended to reflect the choices and personality of the person who built the house. Because they would be picking out what kind of gargoyles or patterns or sort of you know designs they would want in different and wall panels. And so modernism took a lot of that personality out of the spaces and made them more bare. So I think you know that could be part of it in some way, that people are just reacting to personalities that are long gone, reflected through their architectural choices or something that is
Oh yeah.
creating those ghost
Yeah. Yeah,
events.
like when I first started looking, like one of the other, so the Winchester House was like one of the main things that started this book. The other one was when my ex-wife and I were trying to buy a house in Southern California, in sort of East Hollywood, Echo Park, Silver Lake, in that area. And we didn't have that much money, and so we were looking at the kind of lower end of the market, shall we say, to put it charitably. And like one of the things is that houses on that level were really weirdly idiosyncratic, because people would buy something, like in Echo Park, a lot of those houses were built in the 20s as like 700 square foot bungalows for actors who were shooting on location. And so they you could live in them, but they're pretty small. And so people had started to just sort of jam on unpermitted extensions wherever they could. They would just sort of add a room here, or there would they sort of kind of jerry rig a sort of garage in some weird way. And and so kind of like a Victorian, I saw over and over again these houses that were no longer occupied by people who had left their mark in a very specific way, and very different, I think, than the current trend, the kind of like housing makeover era where everything needs to be as bland as possible because you're going to flip it anyways. And
Yeah.
so and I think, I think that sense of walking into a home where you're like, somebody who was not me lived in this in a very deliberate way, I think is a thing that tends to trigger those kinds of feelings, I think.
That's really interesting. Because we bemoan, too much millennial gray or people decorating their houses like they're about to be shown in a real estate listing. Um, and yet we get the creepy crawlies when someone actually shows us their personality. Is that kind of what I'm
I,
hearing
I mean,
here?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that there are some, I think kind of universal kind of ways in which we inhabit houses. They're not universal, but like certainly cultural, and like you could call it sort of feng shui or whatever. But like there are some things that I think we just do. We organize structures in a specific way. You don't put the bathroom off the kitchen because that's weird. That's just a thing that just so some things are quite universal, and I think other things are not. And so, some ways people live are very different than other people, and some people like their space arranged in a very different way. And I think when you encounter that, it's sort of like, I mean, it's very close in a just kind of generic way to this concept of the uncanny, this idea that something is familiar but also strange, right? So you're in a house that looks like a house, it feels like a house, and yet there are these singular differences that you would never have done, you would never have chosen, you're not used to, and it gives it that sense of something is familiar but not right at the same time.
And did you visit any other interesting haunted places or places with good stories behind them in the writing of this book?
Yeah, I mean, I went all over the country, and part of it involved my ex wife and I moving from LA to New York when we drove cross country with our dog, and I tried to like plan out as many haunted places as we could stop in on the way. So, stopped in the Stoll Cemetery in Kansas, which is supposedly a mouth to hell. Um, um,
Wow.
yeah, I mean,
In Kansas, of all places.
it was like early September in Kansas, and so it felt like hell. Like it was just humid and dire on like all fronts. But we did not see any devils or anything like that. But yeah, and then of course when you tell your friends, hey, I'm traveling around the country looking for haunted places. Do you want to meet me somewhere? That tends to go over really well. So yeah, so I got friends to meet me in New Orleans. I got friends to meet me in St. Louis. And I just kind of so yeah. So what did I ended up going to the Lemp Mansion in St. Louis, which is another one of the houses that makes the 10 most haunted houses in the country, because it was the Lemp family was this kind of brewery empire that three separate members of the family committed suicide in that house, and it sort of became kind of legendary on that front. I got hired by Maxim magazine to write a piece about the owner of the Mustang Ranch brothel outside of Reno. And while they actually killed the piece, they never ran it. They did pay for my travel, and while I was there, just kind of interviewing people, the madam told me that the Mustang Ranch was haunted, and so like I kind of just like spent a lot of time talking to the workers at the Mustang Ranch and about nominally about the thing I was supposed to be writing for Maxim, but then also on the side I was like, okay, but also tell me the ghost stories. So yeah, I
What did
tried.
you hear?
What's that?
What kind of things were people experiencing at this ranch?
There were. I mean, it's funny. It's really fascinating. So the Mustang Ranch, the parking lot is among the many places that are haunted because there was uh, s- amateur but pretty well known boxer who was shot in the parking lot because he was maybe having an affair with the owner of the Mustang Ranch. And so the Mustang Ranch parking lot is supposedly haunted by his ghost. But what I find really fascinating is the Mustang Ranch has physically been moved. It is not in the same location it was in the 70s when this murder took place. And so the parking lot is a whole new patch of ground, which I guess like, the ghost managed to follow it. Didn't go into that, doesn't go in the house, but no, but it was interesting because, I was talking to,
It's haunting the brand, not the
yeah, yeah,
physical
right.
location. Okay, I
Yeah.
get it.
So it's,
Very up to date of it.
it's like, you put everything in the pod when you're moving, and then you ship the pod and it arrives. And, when they physically picked up this building and moved it over, and they just brought with it all the ghosts, and they resettled in their normal location. Yeah, but I talked to one woman who had sort of bizarre recordings on her phone that she showed me. And and I was talking to the women who work there about just how like emotionally taxing the job is. Sort of like a lot of sex work is basically just like you're kind of an unlicensed therapist who is sort of and it takes a lot out of the women who work there, and they're really resilient and interesting people, but it's not a job for everybody. And the madam was telling me that a lot of the women can't kind of handle some of it, some aspects of it. And she was saying, it's often the ones who are really struggling with the job who are most likely to see the ghosts. And I said, like, oh, well, then that could make sense. Maybe it's just sort of a stress response, that you're in a tough job, and then you start sort of seeing things and you think they're ghosts. And the madam's like, no, 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 I see them too. So yeah.
So, uh, would you say you are a ghost skeptic? That is,
I mean, what I say, I get asked a lot, like, Colin, do you believe in ghosts? And I think for me, it's kind of an uninteresting question, because I feel like if you believe in ghosts, there is no amount of evidence I can provide to you that will disabuse you of that notion. And if you don't believe in ghosts, there's no amount of evidence I can provide to you that will change your mind and make you think ghosts are real. Like, I just like, it's such a hardwired belief, and you kind of either are or you aren't. And I feel like when I talk about my own beliefs, people are looking for confirmation of their own beliefs. So they're looking to kind of verify whether or not I'm on their team or not. And if I'm not on their team, they'll just ignore me. And so what I would say, rather than talk about my own beliefs, which I kind of find uninteresting, is what I would say is that um, I find the stories that we tell about ghosts way more interesting than I find the paranormal evidence one way or another. I just, like through the course of the book, there were a lot of times where I was like, okay, the story that is being told about this ghost is factually incorrect. Like, historically, this is wrong. I mean, with Sarah Winchester, we know, for example, based on the few documents we have from her, the few letters that we have, that like she didn't build that house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like, she talks in this letter to a cousin about having to lay off the workers over the winter because it was too cold to work. Like, we know that happened, so there are some things I was like, no, the story is false. And that doesn't mean that ghosts aren't real. That just means the story we're telling is not true. And then that, for me, prompts the question, why are we telling that story then? What is it about this story that we continue to tell, even though it's not actually the real story?
yeah. And I think where I was trying to get with that is I absolutely believe 100% that people believe they've seen a ghost, that this is an enduringly common thing, experience that a lot of people have. And at the same time, you know, they are often met with an enduring popular, like, no, you didn't sort of
Yeah.
response. And like, what is, like, how do we deal with that divide? Like, what is a way of, when someone tells you they saw a ghost and you don't believe them, where do you put that? Because they absolutely, like, I 100% believe they thought they saw something.
Oh, no, I don't disbelieve people when they tell me they saw a ghost, because I wasn't there. Like, I don't know, and like um I think that I always want to hear the stories, and I'm always fascinated to hear what people think they saw and why why they saw what they saw and how they processed it and what it meant to them. I mean, I had a friend who told me about, living in a kind of like a squat in Dumbo that was kind of, this warehouse that was sort of, kind of sketchy on a number, and a bunch of artists were all like, sharing this loft space. And she just had this kind of bed in the corner on pallets, and how she would wake up in the middle of the night and see this blue figure floating at the edge of her bed, just kind of this blue translucent figure kind of hovering at the edge of her bed, looking down on her. And, she like, was like, yeah, every night I would wake up and see this thing, and I was like, that's amazing. Like, what do you think it was? And she was like, oh, we had a gas leak. It was carbon monoxide poisoning, like it was just like, you know, um, so sometimes people will tell you amazingly intense ghost stories, but also know will tell you flat out they weren't real. And other people will tell you things where they're just like, I saw a thing, and you're like, what do you think it was? And they're like, I don't know. I just saw a thing. I know that I saw this thing, but I don't have a story for it. So I think you see when you actually, this is because, again, I think this is another thing, the difference between how people actually experience ghosts and the stories that we tell. So when I ask people about their experiences, I usually get things that are not narrative in any shape or form. They're usually like, I saw a thing, or I heard a weird noise, or I came in and then this record player was on all by itself, and I don't know what it means. But then when you like go on a ghost tour, you get these very elaborate, very like usually very standard stories, about the jilted lover, or the cruel like slave owner, or whatever, or and you get these stories that are told over and over again that fit these kind of cliches and stereotypes that are very narratively driven. And so that's, again, what I tried to do in Ghostland, was sort of focus less on, do I believe in ghosts? Are ghosts real? And more on why are we always telling the same kinds of stories whenever we talk about ghosts? Like one of the things I did when I was just starting the book, is I was like, I want to haunt it downtown. I want to do like a whole downtown. So I just started Googling like most haunted downtown in the United States, and one of the hits was Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia.
Oh wow.
Um, and and so I was like, okay, let's go. What do you got? And I started reading all these stories about various like haunted buildings in Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia. And at some point, it just like clicked. I was like, all of these ghosts are about white people. Like, they're all white ghosts. And Shockoe Bottom, like, again, I didn't know Richmond very well when I started, but it didn't take me too long to learn that Shockoe Bottom outside of New Orleans was the highest volume trading market for enslaved people. And I thought, like, this is one of the most deeply traumatized pieces of land in American history, and we are not, the stories we're telling them about it are all about hidden brothels and jilted lovers and saloon fights and crap like that. We're not talking about this other thing at all. So that was to me a much more interesting question than do ghosts exist.
Yeah, it's kind of like the first ghost story you told, where there was this guilty conscience part of the legend where she was being haunted by the ghost of everyone killed by one of these guns, the
Yeah.
people who mass marketed, rifles for the first time. And here is a piece of land with a dark history, um, that people are on it and they feel uncomfortable, and then the ghost stories spring up. Is that?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I mean, one of the other things I wanted to sort of tackle from the very beginning is another sort of popular cliche, which ties into that, is the haunted Indian burial ground.
Mhm.
And why do we tell so many ghost stories about a haunted Indian burial ground? The Shining, Pet Cemetery, all these things. It gets repeated over and over again. And um, what was really fascinating to me to learn, which I had no idea, like when Stephen King was writing Pet Cemetery, which is set in Maine, and involves a haunted Indian burial ground. Like, I was just a kid then, so I wouldn't have been reading the news, but there was a major court case involving some of the indigenous communities of Maine, where they basically noted that the original treaty from the 1820s ceding their land to the United States government was invalid. And they basically launched a court case that basically was like, we are owed, I think, like 70% of the land of Maine. Like it belongs to us, and the treaty is invalid. And it worked its way up the courts, and the courts were unanimously like, yeah, that is correct. That so Stephen King is writing, living in Maine, writing about a haunted Indian burial ground in Maine at the same time that it starts to look like we're like, the United States government is going to lose half of more than half of one of its 50 states. Eventually what happened is they settled for an extreme amount of money, but every judge was like, yeah, this is cut and dried. This treaty is invalid. And so there is this kind of, I think that story in particular is one about, particularly white Americans and their anxiety about this land that we live on, that on some level we know we didn't, our ancestors did not acquire through ethical means, but also we don't, we the descendants of these people don't want to give that up, that and so it creates this tension, and stories about the haunted Indian burial ground becomes a way to like both address that tension while also kind of dismissing it and sort of like writing it off as like a supernatural spook story. So
Yeah, that's. Did you encounter any other instances of sort of, you know, haunted places around, historical, dark places?
I mean, yeah, that's I mean, the problem with this country is that it's a country that is built on trauma, and so these stories are all over the place, and like, for example, one of the things that I uncovered is, when you think of like haunted places, you think of a cemetery, you think of the crossroads, right, in the South, right? That's where the devil, you meet the devil at the crossroads, right?
Hmm.
Um, forests are also haunted, and in the South, before emancipation, these were not entirely coincidentally uh, the places through which enslaved people would escape to freedom, through the forest, through crossroads, through cemeteries, through uninhabited land. And so slave patrols would, before the Civil War, would dress up as ghosts and ride through the forest, trying to spark rumors and legends that the forest was haunted, and if you went in there at night, you would be killed, as a kind of psychological warfare to to keep people from trying to escape for freedom. So yeah, like and obviously not all ghost stories have that kind of traumatized legacy, but a lot of them do, and a lot of the ways that we have tried to make sense of of trauma and mourning and melancholy have been to kind of encase them in ghost stories that we then tell around the fire as a means of sort of approaching this stuff without getting too close.
Yeah, that's and I didn't know that history. That's kind of a wild story of, seeding ghost stories to try to keep people in line.
Well, and yeah, and after the war, the kind of earliest, kind of the proto Ku Klux Klan, and then the earliest iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, one of the many things they would do is dress up like ghosts and show up at black sharecroppers' homes in the middle of the night and say, we are the ghosts of the Confederate soldiers who died at Manassas. We are the ghosts from Antietam. Basically, again, of kind of psychological warfare, and this kind of racist stereotype that black people are quote unquote like more superstitious than white people. You sort of look at it and you're like, I think if a bunch of violent drunk people showed up at my house at the middle of the night and said they were ghosts, I would say, yes, I believe you are ghosts and I am scared. I would basically do anything I could to get them off my fucking lawn.
Yeah.
So I think that like, some of this becomes a sort of like feedback loop where white people convince themselves they're tricking black people, and black people are basically just trying not to get killed by violent racists. So all of that I think feeds into the stories. And if you look at the other thing I did is look up the WPA interviews of surviving formerly enslaved people from the 30s, and they talk about ghosts, and they talk about what they believed and what they were taught to believe, and how there's one story in there that I couldn't get out of my mind about this guy who talked about when he was a kid. There was this ghost story about this guy in a wagon, and the he was like a ghost, and he would take their souls and to stay away from him. And then he's like, later we found out that he was just like a slave catcher, and that's the story our parents told us when we were kids to keep us away from there. So yeah.
Wow. Do you have a favorite ghost story?
Oh, I mean, they're all so fascinating to me, and they're fascinating for different reasons. I mean, I, I mean that because the Sarah Winchester story was the one that started the whole project in a way. It's usually the one that I come back to. I've written the most about in other forms, and I think it's really a kind of fascinating story, and it continues to pay dividends. But I also, you know, I love them all. They're like your children, each one is
Yeah,
special in
yeah.
its own way.
Were there any haunted places that you visited or stories that you heard where you felt, the goosebumps, the feeling of being haunted?
I mean, not actually when I was doing research for the book, because I think in that you're such in a mindset of like, I'm here to do research. So like you're kind of your senses are perked up in a different kind of way. And you're kind of, but I will say the most upsetting place that I went to was a place in Moundsville, West Virginia, the Moundsville Penitentiary, which, is, cited as one of the most haunted prisons in the country. And it's now no longer used as a prison. They do tours and like, Halloween, houses there in the fall. Again, it was from a period in American architecture where um, the goal of the architecture itself, part of the was like to enhance the punishment. So the idea was, there people talk about how to design prisons. They're like, it should be melancholic, so
Oh
that
wow.
people who are there, feel the weight, like, and so it was sort of this massive fortress. The walls are super thick, and there's just these huge stone walls, and these kind of towers and stuff. But it was also just like, the hallways were like the ceilings were really low, and the everything was so cramped, and like the cells were meant for like one person a piece, but by the time it closed, each cell had three people in it, so it was like overcrowded and cramped, and it just like you just felt every step of the way, you just felt the walls, pressing in on you in a way that like it just really like just made me sad to be in it. And I knew somebody, one of my friends was actually from that area and had worked there for like one fall for this kind of haunted house thing. And he would talk about like like a seasonal job, you guys all hang out after work and you like drink and you just kind of hang out. And he was like, we didn't. Like as soon as we closed up shop, everybody got out of there. Nobody wanted to be in there for like a second longer, and so there was something just deeply unpleasant about that place, and that kind of stayed with me.
Wow. Yeah, it's not often that someone builds a building with the distinct purpose of making someone suffer inside of it. I bet you could feel that. I mean, sometimes buildings just don't work, and they're not great spaces, but it's not designed to be oppressive.
Yeah, no, this was absolutely, it was like, how can we make a building sad so that people there feel sad, and it like it furthers the punishment of incarceration.
You said that when you're in research mode, you're just not going to feel that creepy crawly feeling because you're sort of you're researching. Do you think that sort of the state someone's in, sort of a more liminal space, dreamy space, like your friend in the middle of the night kind of things, that these are the moments if someone's going to see a ghost where it happens? And what is the connection to kind of state of mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. It's hard to say for sure because you can't really A/B test it.
Yeah.
But I would go down that road. Yeah. Like, again, like but I don't know how you would ever confirm that. So you kind of just have to, you know,
You went on from your book Ghostland, and the history of American haunted places to a book called The Unidentified, mythical monsters, alien encounters, and the obsession with the unexplained. You know, what is the through line between ghosts and these sort of other uncanny stories that you see?
I mean, I think so. My very first book was about phrenology, and it was about how some famous people's heads were stolen after their death. Beethoven, Mozart, Franz Joseph Haydn, Emanuel Swedenborg had their heads stolen by different people. It wasn't all the same crew, but different people who were interested in phrenology and interested in the idea that the bumps on your head could reveal, in this case, like where is musical genius, like where is it to be found in the brain. um and of course, like, phrenology is junk, like it's worse than junk as a science, but for about 50 years it had a really important cultural impact. And I think one of the things that taught me was that just because something is like silly or not taken seriously or derelict doesn't mean it doesn't still have an important impact on culture, and still doesn't mean it doesn't have something to tell us fascinating about culture. And so that's part of the thing that also led me to ghosts, because again, I think ghosts are things that are not taken seriously, certainly by the scientific community, and also not really by the religious community. I mean, there's sort of this kind of third ground, but yet it's an enormously important belief system for many people. It's a huge tourism driver for places like the Winchester Mystery House. And so I think from there I started to kind of think more broadly about, like, what are these other things. And so I became really interested in the fact that, like, I read some statistic. I was just sort of going around that like at the time, like 14% of Americans believe in Bigfoot, which doesn't seem
Yeah.
like a whole lot until you do the numbers. You're like, that's like 42 million people. That is a lot of actual human beings.
Yeah.
So that kind of led me to the unidentified, which I looked at because of the way these topics ended up kind of overlapping in these really fascinating and unexpected ways between the lost continent of Atlantis and its sister in the Pacific, Lemuria. Cryptids, so Nessie, Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, and then UFOs. And so the book kind of looks at those kind of three things broadly, and the sort of question of, another way to say it would be sort of Fordiana. So, like, things that Charles Fort kind of wrote about and kind of established. But like, one of the things that, it was sort of this question of, like, if ghosts are about our relationship to history and our relationship to architecture and our relationship to death and mourning, what are these other things? Why are we so interested in Bigfoot? Why are we so interested in UFOs? And I think, I came to a place of sort of understanding them as much more about space and kind of the edge of civilization and this kind of realm of the unknown that's right on the edge of the map that we're always kind of like trying to create, and imagine this space that is just over there, where and that's where the wild things are. And that became kind of the organizing kind of feature of that book.
Oh, cool. And UFOs, though, have gone from being completely unserious to front page news on the New York Times.
Does that make them
Um,
unserious? They're still.
oh, I don't know. And like last summer, I think it was, there was all these lights rising out of the ocean, going over everything here near me in New Jersey. I live in Philadelphia. So
Yeah.
I don't know what to think about that one anymore.
I mean,
Is it
one of the
something we have to
things.
take seriously as a real news event, or is it still in the realm of the uncanny and wild unknown?
Well, I mean, one of the things I said at the time, yeah, there was like a whistleblower, and there was like a front page story. It was co-written by this woman, Leslie Keene. And like, we were all gonna, everybody was like, "This is it. We're getting it now." And one of the things I said at the time is, I said, if UFOs are real, if we and I will maintain this, if we have evidence that UFOs are real, it's not going to come from a whistleblower. It's not going to come from a journalist. It's not going to come from a publication. It is instantly going to be the biggest story in the history of stories, and everybody is going to be on it. And again, like if you remember back to, and we're kind of back to this now. This is happening now with Epstein, but in the early days of the Trump administration, the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and other stories or other venues were always trying to scoop each other. And it was, like I remember somebody would have this big scoop that would drop. And then within an hour, somebody else, the New York Times would say, we can now also confirm this. We can independently. So you saw in real time how these outlets were all trying to verify the same thing. They were all working their sources. And so I just know that if the government has evidence, we would have known about it, because this idea of a lone whistleblower over what would be the biggest story ever in the history of humanity does not wash. And it doesn't track with other scandals. It doesn't track with how Watergate unfolded. It doesn't track with how Iran Contra unfolded. It doesn't track on how we learned about the Manhattan Project. It just doesn't. So it's like, do UFOs exist? I don't know. Are there extraterrestrials out there somewhere in the galaxy? Most likely. But does the government have secret evidence they're hiding up? Almost certainly not. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just responding to what I see in the headlines and wondering about this topic, because they did have really interesting stories that I guess
Yeah.
were verified by journalists that are uncanny and unexplainable about Navy
Yeah.
pilots, seeing really weird stuff and getting video.
Yeah. So if you go back to 1951, Donald Kehoe was an investigative journalist who published a book, the name of which escapes me because they're all kind of the same book title in various forms. It was like UFOs are real or something like that. But it was from 1951, and Kehoe had a bunch of Navy and Air Force pilots on the record saying, "I saw this thing that I couldn't understand," and so we have actually had that story for basically since World War II, and so the in and of itself, a pilot saying, "I saw something I couldn't explain," is a mainstay, and it doesn't actually break new news. And I again, like it's weird for me because when I talk about ghosts, I'm as we've been talking about, I tend to be very open and and like kind of I just want to hear what people believe and that kind of stuff. When it gets to like UFOs, I'm like, no, 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 this is actually wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting because in some ways, there's more, pictures and video of the UFOs that, editors that are tougher than me in like the New York Times or the Washington Post have seen fit to print,
Yeah,
um, which is, evidence of a kind. I don't think it proves what
yeah,
exactly is happening, but that's something. And
right.
that at the same time, you are more skeptical of this story. I think that's interesting.
Well, again, because and this is one of the things I learned when I was researching the unidentified and putting it together is that if you believe in ghosts or if you believe in Bigfoot,
Hmm.
you either do or you don't. But you don't believe that um, the government has evidence of ghosts that they are covering up. Whereas if you believe in UFOs, you almost have to believe that there's a government cover up. It's impossible to sort of believe in UFOs and not sort of think that there's some sort of cover up. And so what I found is that the issue about UFOs is they bring with them a level of conspiracy theory and paranoia that ghosts and Bigfoot simply do not. And so I think that's what I end up responding to is sort of like less about the belief in the abstract and more what the belief entails as a sort of necessary condition, and that is an introduction of conspiracy theories, which so the unidentified as a book sort of begins kind of in a more open space, where Ghostland was, and sort of moves more towards this question of like how are these conspiracy theories dominating this discourse, and what happens once we get to that level of distrust and paranoia and that kind of thing.
Okay, why are conspiracy theories more dangerous than seeing things that might not be there, or the things that happen with ghost stories?
I mean, one can gesture broadly at our current political situation, which was driven by weaponizing conspiracy theories. Donald Trump does not believe in or does not make a big deal about how he believes in ghosts. He makes a big deal about how he thinks that Obama is not a legal U.S. citizen. So I think that the problem with conspiracy theories is that um, the purpose of a conspiracy theory for me is that it is there to give you permission to discount your senses and to believe things that you may not feel um, are socially acceptable to believe otherwise. So if you are raised to think that racism is bad, and that we should that I personally am not a racist because I believe in equality. And then somebody comes along and says that the civil rights movement in which black people are fighting for equality is actually a conspiracy by Soviet Jews who are prompting them to do this. Suddenly you can now reconcile a belief that both I personally am good, but also we need to stop this civil rights movement. And that's not racist of me. I'm being anti-communist and fighting back against the elders of Zion and crap like that. So that's the conspiracy theory structure is designed to encourage you to believe um, to not believe your eyes, to not believe what's right in front of you, because for a lot of people, what's actually in front of them is confusing and stressful, and maybe goes against their values and beliefs, but they like it anyways. And so the conspiracy theory is there to tell you that it's okay to believe like bad thoughts, basically.
Yeah, paranoia and conspiracy theories. Um, just, I think it's very possible to believe the UFO stuff without having a conspiratorial idea about the government. I've heard a lot of people in that
Okay.
way,
Yeah.
just in the
Yeah.
sense of like, epistemological shock. All these Navy pilots, they're seeing something,
Sure.
whether it's altitude creating hallucinations in the air, but it's uncanny and it's weird,
Yeah.
and it challenges, you know, a lot of ideas we have about how the world works. And whenever you having ideas where like if something's happening, it's like these people who you said are seeing ghosts but don't believe in ghosts. It's like when people are experiencing something that doesn't fit their worldview, you reject it. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
there's something happening, there's no reason the government wouldn't also be having that reaction to the
Um,
evidence.
yeah, I mean, again, yeah, there are things out there, and I am the unidentified looking at a couple of stories, kind of famous canonical stories that I just don't have good answers for. Like one of the main stories I go back to is the Great Kentucky Meat Shower of 1881, which I'm like, I don't know what it was. The best story available to us sucks. So there's still things out there, and the Socorro, New Mexico UFO sighting is another one where I was like, I don't know.
I don't know those stories.
um, yeah, there. Yeah, the Socorro, New Mexico story involved a a New Mexico police officer who was following somebody on a high speed chase, and then sort of saw this weird sort of thing and pulled off to go investigate it. And it's it's involved and detailed enough from his first, like his immediate eyewitnesses. It doesn't track with the kind of same generic level of, like I saw a thing in the sky that could have been anything, but like, um I don't know, does is it I think my argument by the end of the unidentified is that, yeah, there are going to be things that are out there and that are unexplained. I think that our tendency is to immediately explain them in ways that make us feel good. And I think it's much harder but more interesting to keep them unexplained. And I think yeah, people are looking for evidence for their own worldview and their own beliefs. And the problem with UFO sightings is because they're so ambiguous and vague. it's really easy for you to just take it as confirmation what you already believe in, which does get us back a little bit, I think, to the issue about ghost stories and why ghost stories always sound the same. So
After sort of looking into all these places of, from junk science to ghost stories to UFOs, Bigfoot, what do you think you learned about, what we do with that uncanny space, or those things that we can't really know for sure what's going on?
yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem. I think what we do is rather than live in it, we default to sort of comforting stories that we already know to explain away that uncanny space. And I think it's a fear and anxiety about the unknown. It's a fear and anxiety about death. It is a number of things, but I mean, um, the kind of history that I tell in the Unidentified has to do with this moment in the late 19th or late 18th, early 19th century when religion and science start to split apart really dramatically, right? So like prior to the 19th century, the study of science of the natural world is also the study of God, because God has made the natural world. And so if you are learning about plants and animals, you are reading the book of nature that God has written. And then this starts to split, most dramatically with Darwin and this idea that these two worldviews are actually incompatible, and these kind of schisms form, and lines are drawn. And what the stuff in the Unidentified and the stuff basically that I write about Ghostland and elsewhere is the stuff that fell in between that gap. It's the stuff that neither science nor religion really wanted to claim in any way. Stuff they couldn't quite like put into those kind of respective worldviews, and so just kind of left on the table. And you can add astrology and crystals and all sorts of other, things that get kind of lumped under the category just like woo. But that kind of middle ground um, is both disregarded by these two poles and also incredibly important for how culture manifests itself. And I
Yeah,
think,
woo is so popular. I mean, right now
yeah,
and always.
yeah. I mean, I was just at a reading last night in Bushwick where every reader was introduced by their astrological sign. So,
What kind of
but
reading?
again, what's that?
What kind of reading?
It's just like normal fiction. They were all
Okay,
young
fiction
people,
writers.
fiction, moved to New York, having trouble dating. It's in a short story, whatever, that kind of stuff.
Okay, okay.
But yeah, but it was a astrology themed reading, and so this stuff is everywhere right now. And I think that um, what people are looking for a way to sort of process things that don't sort of fall into those camps of science or religion, and that ground is sort of because it's sort of not treated seriously. There's a lot of room for hucksterism and cranks and conspiracy theories and just general bullshit. And I think that without kind of being more kind of critically open to the need that's driving that space, while also being critically aware of what those products do and don't do for us, I think we have to be aware of that, or else it's going to continue to like seduce people to kind of act and believe things that I think are antisocial. Like it's not a question of like what's right and what's wrong. It's like, are you going to use these beliefs in ways that are like harmful for the community, for the country, or whatever? I mean, like half the time I see people invoking astrology, I feel like it's an excuse for their own kind of annoying or problematic behavior, when they'll just be like, well, I'm like this because Leos are like this. And I'm like, you're like this because you're a jerk and you don't want to deal with your problem. Like, because you were born in August doesn't have anything to do with that. But it's like that kind of thing. So like, um, so it's not a question of like, are these things real or not? It's like, what are you doing with these beliefs, and are these beliefs antisocial on some small or large level?
Well, now I've never had this thought before, but now that we've run full course with this conversation, I think woo in all its forms has a lot of similarities with Victorian architecture,
Oh
just in
yeah,
that you can make a lot of choices that
Yeah.
reflect your personality. Like, are you like an astrology guy or a crystal girl?
Yeah.
And are you obsessed with Bigfoot or are you like totally into the aliens thing? Like, these are all sort of aesthetic choices in some ways, as well as vibes and like sort of what you get into, and they reflect personality. Like,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
notice when someone's really into one of these things, and are they doing it in a paranoid way or in a kind of like wow way that's like, isn't the world big and wonderful, and this is sort of adds mystique and charm to my existence. um, that there's just a lot of choices you could, if you are exploring you, that you can make that reflect something more about you than anything else.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I think, yeah, there was like a period, a couple decades ago when I think the country as a whole was more religious, but people were sort of picking and choosing what kind of denomination they wanted to go to based on like what you kind of fit their profile, which I always thought was a little weird. I was like, like if you're a believer, like either God is or God isn't. Like this idea that you could kind of like choose the version of God that seemed cool to you seemed kind of weird. But I think now that's happening sort of
Americans
outside of
love to
religion.
shop.
And like one of these readers last night, they were all supposed to be Cancers or Leos because it's that time of the year. But one of them was like, I much more identify with my Aries rising or some nonsense like that. I was like, well, you either believe in this crap or you don't. You can't believe in it and then say, but actually, like I'm actually an Aries. I'm not actually a Cancer. I'm like, yeah. So, but yeah, to your point,
All
yes,
right, so uh, why did you go to this reading, and what is your astrological sign?
I went because a friend of mine who is a normal person happened to be reading and I wanted to support her and like, and it was only when I got there I was like, oh, this is a very different vibe than I was expecting. So, yeah.
Okay, well, this has been a really fun discussion. If any of our audience would like to look into some of your books or your journalism, where can they follow you, find out more about you, see your book list?
Yeah, I mean the books are pretty widely available. Ghostland, The Unidentified, and the most recent one, which we didn't get into, is on sort of conspiracy theories around secret societies called Under the Eye of Power, and basically how we have used Freemasons and the Illuminati and whatever to kind of make sense of the world. So those are out there. I do a lot of work for Atlas Obscura. I wrote a column for them about like sort of eerie places. So that's another place you can find me. I also do a monthly event with Atlas called Monster of the Month, where I pick a new like cryptid or demon or monster or something like that, and talk about kind of its sort of history and what it means and that kind of stuff. So those are some places. And then I'm on Blue Sky at just my name, Colin Dickey. Yeah, find me and say hi or ask questions or whatever. Yeah,
All right, thank you so much for joining us, Colin.
yeah. Thanks for having me on. This is a lot of fun.